The heavy oak doors of the Manhattan law firm sealed shut, muting the chaotic symphony of New York City traffic raging 50 floors below. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was refrigerated and sterile, smelling faintly of expensive lemon polish and impending finality. Alexander Sterling sat at the head of the long glass table, a man who commanded billion-dollar boardrooms with the same lethal precision he used in the operating theater. At 38, he was the ruthless CEO and chief architect of Sterling Medical Innovations, an empire poised to consume the East Coast's healthcare market. To Alexander, this Friday afternoon was merely a logistical hurdle, a necessary reallocation of assets. He stared down at the divorce decree resting on the smooth glass. The legal typography was dense and dispassionate, a stark contrast to the 8 years of whispered midnight promises and shared warmth it was actively dissolving. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored Tom Ford suit and extracted his silver Mont Blanc pen. It felt balanced, heavy, much like the surgical scalpel he had wielded flawlessly for over a decade. He signed his name with a swift, aggressive stroke. The ink bled slightly into the thick parchment, black and unyielding. He rationalized the coldness in his chest. It was the only logical outcome. For the past 3 years, the relentless expansion of his empire had demanded nothing less than his soul. He had become a ghost haunting their sprawling Upper East Side penthouse, offering Clara only the exhausted, irritable remnants of his time. He told himself he was doing her a profound kindness. He was setting her free from the burden of a man whose true marriage was to his ambition. There was time, he mused privately. Time for her to find someone who could be present, and perhaps years down the line, time for him to feel something other than the crushing weight of his own success. Across the expanse of the glass table sat Clara. She did not reach for the pen immediately. Instead, she looked at the document, her movements agonizingly deliberate. Alexander briefly studied her, his clinical eye noting the changes he had previously dismissed as the natural toll of their failing marriage. Her usually vibrant botanical dresses had been replaced by an oversized cashmere sweater that seemed to swallow her small frame. Her skin, once glowing with a healthy, sun-kissed warmth from hours spent in her greenhouse, possessed a brittle porcelain pallor. Even under the harsh fluorescent lighting, the dark bruised shadows beneath her expressive hazel eyes were impossible to ignore. Yet as a genius diagnostician, Alexander was entirely blind. He saw the physical manifestations of grief, assuming her weight loss and pallor were the byproducts of their emotional severing. He never looked close enough to see the ghost of mortality lingering just beneath her skin. Clara picked up the pen. Her hand, slender and trembling ever so slightly, hovered over the signature line. In her mind, she was not signing a divorce decree. She was signing a pardon. A wave of exhaustion washed over her so profound and bone-deep that it threatened to pull her under. But she anchored herself, forcing her spine straight. She thought of the man sitting across from her, the man she had loved since he was a sleep-deprived resident with a kind smile long before the tailored suits and the Wall Street features. She loved him enough to let him go entirely unburdened. Without a single tear, Clara signed her name. "It's done," the senior attorney murmured carefully, sliding the documents into a manila folder. The sound of the paper scraping against the glass was the only noise in the cavernous room. Clara stood up. She gathered her leather tote bag, the one Alexander had bought for her in Paris. During an anniversary trip that felt like a lifetime ago, she looked at him. Her hazel eyes holding no malice, no bitterness, only a vast echoing sorrow that made Alexander's breath catch in his throat. "Take care of yourself, Alex," she said softly. Her voice was breathy, lacking its usual melodic resonance, but the affection in it was agonizingly genuine. She didn't sound like a woman who had just been discarded for a corporate merger. She sounded entirely at peace. Alexander stood buttoning his jacket, a defensive barrier against the sudden irrational panic rising in his chest. "You too, Clara. The settlement is more than generous. If you ever need anything—" "I won't," she interrupted gently, offering a small fractured smile. "Goodbye." He watched her turn and walk toward the double doors. Her steps were slow, lacking her usual effortless grace, as if she were walking through waist-deep water. Alexander felt a sudden violent urge to call her back to ask her why her coat looked 3 sizes too big to ask her if she was eating. But his phone buzzed violently in his pocket, a priority notification regarding the Vanguard Hospital acquisition. The Empire was calling. He checked the screen, and by the time he looked up, the heavy oak doors had clicked shut. Clara was gone. Alexander walked out of the building and stepped into his waiting town car, the city's chaotic energy matching the hum of his business empire. He immediately dialed his chief operating officer, plunging into a conversation about stock valuations and board votes. He pushed the image of Clara's pale face out of his mind, locking it away in a dark corner of his consciousness. He went to sleep that night in a luxurious empty hotel suite, thoroughly convinced he had executed the hardest yet most necessary decision of his life. He was a master of the human anatomy, a conqueror of the corporate world, yet he remained blissfully, tragically unaware that while he was calculating profit margins, his ex-wife was lying awake in the dark, clutching a blue folder from the oncology department, counting the dwindling days she had left. The weeks following the finalization of the divorce blurred into a hyper-focused, relentless montage of corporate conquests and clinical triumphs. By late November, the brutal winds of winter had descended upon New York City, mirroring the icy, untouchable aura that Alexander Sterling projected to the world. The Vanguard Hospital acquisition, a multi-billion-dollar merger that had been the primary catalyst for the destruction of his marriage, was officially complete. Overnight, Sterling Medical Innovations became the undisputed titan of the East Coast healthcare syndicate. Alexander's face graced the cover of Forbes, his sharp aristocratic features and piercing blue eyes immortalized under the headline, "The Surgeon Who Carved an Empire." To the outside world, Alexander was a man at the absolute zenith of his existence. He was revered, feared, and relentlessly pursued. Yet the reality of his triumph felt entirely different once the flashbulbs stopped popping and the boardroom emptied. His triumphant return to the sprawling 8,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking Central Park felt less like a victory lap, and more like stepping into a beautifully curated mausoleum. The silence of the apartment was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating entity that seemed to press against his chest the moment the private elevator doors slid open. Clara had taken very little with her when she left, insisting she didn't want his money or his properties, just a clean break. Because of her refusal to pack up her life, the penthouse remained a devastating museum of the woman he had let slip away. Her presence was stubbornly woven into the very fabric of the home. It was in the faint, lingering scent of lavender and linseed oil that haunted the hallways. It was in the soft woven throw blankets draped over the stark, modern Italian leather sofas, warm touches she had added to soften his rigid, monochromatic world. But nowhere was her absence felt more violently than in the glass-enclosed solarium facing the park. This had been Clara's sanctuary, a lush, verdant jungle where she painted her breathtaking botanical illustrations. Now, without her meticulous care, the rare orchids were dropping their petals, and the rich green ferns were beginning to brown at the edges. One evening, exhausted after a grueling 14-hour day, Alexander wandered into the solarium, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand. He found a half-finished sketch of a weeping willow left abandoned on her easel. His fingers brushed against the rough texture of the charcoal, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the meticulously constructed dam in his mind cracked. A wave of profound, agonizing loneliness washed over him so intense it made his hands shake. He quickly downed the scotch, the burn of the alcohol providing a necessary distraction from the burn in his chest. He turned his back on the dying garden and locked the solarium door. He never opened it again. To survive the deafening quiet of his personal life, Alexander transformed himself into a machine. He used the hospital as a shield, burying himself beneath mountains of administrative paperwork and scrubbing in for the most high-risk complex cardiothoracic surgeries he could find. He became a phantom in his own hospital, stalking the sterile, white-walled corridors at 3 in the morning, finding solace only in the rhythmic, predictable beeping of heart monitors. In the operating theater, he was in absolute control. He could stop a beating heart, repair it, and shock it back to life. Biology and physics made sense. They followed rules. They didn't pack a single suitcase and walk out the door with a sad, fractured smile. His colleagues whispered about his relentless stamina, mistaking his manic work ethic for dedication. They didn't realize that the brilliant CEO was terrified to go home. If he stopped moving, if he allowed himself even a moment of stillness, the phantom pain of his amputated marriage would flare up. He found himself reaching for her in the middle of the night, his hand sweeping across the cold, empty expanse of the California king bed, only to wake up with a hollow ache in his stomach when his fingers grasped nothing but silk sheets. Sometimes he would pull out his phone, his thumb hovering over her contact name, drafting messages he would never send. Asterisk, how is the new place? Are you eating well? I saw a painting today that reminded me of you. He always deleted them. He had promised to give her a clean break, and Alexander Sterling was a man who kept his word even if it was destroying him from the inside out. He rationalized his misery with clinical detachment. He told himself it was simply an adjustment period, withdrawal symptoms from an 8-year dependency. He firmly believed that time would callous over the wound, that eventually the empire he had sacrificed everything to build would be enough to keep him warm. He was a man who saved strangers from the brink of death every single day, hailed as a modern-day miracle worker. Yet he remained tragically, fatally blind to the irony of his existence. He had all the power in the world, but he had let the only woman he ever truly loved walk away, completely unaware that her own heart was quietly, inevitably failing. 300 miles north of the towering glass fortresses of Manhattan, the world was reduced to the muted, monochromatic hues of the Maine coastline. Clara had rented a small, weather-beaten cottage on the edge of a rocky cliff in Ogunquit, a place where the furious Atlantic Ocean crashed against the stone with a rhythmic, isolating violence. It was a stark, brutal landscape, entirely devoid of the polished luxury she had left behind at the penthouse, but it offered the one thing she desperately needed as her time ran out: absolute, impenetrable anonymity. Her days, once filled with the vibrant colors of her botanical illustrations and the lively chatter of charity luncheons, had narrowed into a fragile, exhausting routine of basic survival. The illness, a particularly aggressive and silent form of leukemia that had hidden itself until it was far too late, was no longer a looming threat. It was an active, consuming fire within her blood. The physical toll was devastating. Clara's mornings began with a grueling battle just to rise from her narrow quilt-covered bed. Her joints ached with a deep, echoing cold that no amount of woolen blankets could banish. The beautiful waist-length auburn hair that Alexander used to bury his face in after a long shift at the hospital was now falling out in alarming, brittle handfuls, leaving her scalp tender and her spirit fractured. She had covered the cottage's small bathroom mirror with a towel weeks ago, unwilling to look at the skeletal, hollow-eyed stranger who had stolen her reflection. On the small, scarred wooden table in the center of her kitchen sat the blue folder from the oncology department. It was her constant, quiet executioner. Beside it lay a staggering array of orange prescription bottles, painkillers and anti-nausea medications that provided only fleeting illusions of relief. She had refused the aggressive experimental chemotherapy trials her doctors had pushed for. The prognosis had been clear: a grueling, agonizing battle for perhaps a few extra months of life spent entirely in sterile hospital beds with tubes snaking from her arms. Clara had made her choice with terrifying clarity. She did not want to die as a patient, and more importantly, she refused to let Alexander watch her wither away. She knew the man she had married better than he knew himself. If Alexander had known about her diagnosis, his suffocating sense of duty and his God complex as a surgeon would have forced him to drop everything. He would have abandoned his empire, sacrificed the hospital merger he had spent years agonizing over, and chained himself to her bedside in a desperate, futile attempt to fix what was unfixable. He would have resented his failure and eventually her. She loved him far too fiercely to let her death become the anchor that dragged his brilliant life down into the dark. One bitterly cold Tuesday afternoon, Clara sat wrapped in a thick cardigan by the frosted window, a cup of untouched herbal tea growing cold in her trembling hands. On her lap rested a copy of the latest Forbes magazine. She had bought it at the local pharmacy, her heart doing a painful, erratic flutter when she saw his face on the glossy cover. Alexander looked magnificent. His sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes commanded authority, radiating the untouchable power of a man who had conquered the world. She traced the outline of his cheekbone with a pale, fragile finger. There was no bitterness in her heart, only a vast aching ocean of love. She read the article detailing his ruthless acquisition of Vanguard Hospital, absorbing the quotes about his unmatched work ethic and his visionary leadership. He had everything he had ever wanted. Her sacrifice, monumental and soul-crushing as it was, had worked. She had bought him his empire with the currency of her own silence. A sudden, violent coughing fit ripped through her chest, shattering the quiet of the cottage. The magazine slipped from her lap, falling to the floorboards as Clara doubled over, gasping for air that felt like inhaled glass. The pain was sudden and blinding, a fiery claw gripping her ribs and squeezing the life from her lungs. She slipped from the chair, her knees hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thud. She curled into a tight ball, her hands clutching her chest as she fought against the suffocating darkness pressing in on the edges of her vision. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity before the coughing finally subsided, leaving her limp, soaked in a cold sweat and terrifyingly weak. She lay on the floor, listening to the howling wind outside, the sheer reality of her isolation crashing down upon her. She was dying entirely alone in a house at the edge of the world. Tears, hot and unbidden, finally spilled over her lashes, tracing tracks down her sunken cheeks. It wasn't the fear of death that made her cry. It was the sudden, overwhelming realization of how much she missed him. She missed the heavy cadence of his footsteps in the hallway. She missed the grounding weight of his hand resting on the small of her back. She had orchestrated this lonely end to protect him. But as she pressed her forehead against the cold wooden floor, the bravado of her sacrifice vanished, leaving only a terrified woman who desperately wanted her husband. With trembling, bruised fingers, Clara reached for her phone resting on the leg of the chair. She didn't call Alexander. Instead, she dialed the only other person in the world who knew the truth, her best friend Rachel. The phone rang 3 times before Rachel answered, her voice immediately thick with panic at the sound of Clara's ragged breathing. Clara, talk to me. Are you okay?" Clara closed her eyes, the last of her strength ebbing away like the tide outside her window. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice a broken, ghostly rasp. "It's getting worse. I don't think I have much time left." The blizzard hit Manhattan with a brutal, howling intensity, turning the city that never slept into a muted white wasteland. Inside the executive suite of Sterling Medical Innovations, the temperature was perfectly regulated at a comfortable 70 degrees. Alexander stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a solitary figure silhouetted against the storm, a glass of amber bourbon loosely gripped in his right hand. The hospital below him hummed with life, a well-oiled machine operating precisely to his specifications. But as he watched the snow erase the sharp edges of the city, his mind betrayed him, slipping backward in time to a winter that felt entirely different. He turned away from the glass and walked over to his massive mahogany desk. Unlocking the bottom drawer, a drawer his assistant was strictly forbidden from touching, he reached past the stacks of confidential acquisition files and pulled out a small, frayed, spiral-bound sketchbook. It was an anomaly in his impeccably organized minimalist world. He opened it, the worn pages falling naturally to a charcoal sketch of a simple, unbloomed snowdrop. Beneath the drawing, written in Clara's elegant flowing script, were the words, "For Alex, even in the deepest winter we will grow." The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. 10 years ago, Alexander Sterling was not a billionaire CEO. He was a 28-year-old surgical resident drowning in medical school debt, surviving on vending machine coffee and 4 hours of sleep a night. He was brilliant, driven by a desperate, hungry ambition to claw his way to the top of the medical hierarchy, but he was also profoundly, utterly exhausted. His world had been entirely composed of harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, and the constant high-stakes pressure of keeping people alive. And then he walked into the pediatric wing on a Tuesday afternoon and saw her. Clara had been hired by the hospital to paint a sprawling, vibrant botanical mural to brighten the dreary walls of the children's ward. She was perched on a step stool wearing paint-splattered overalls, her hair pulled up in a messy bun secured by 2 wooden paintbrushes. She was humming softly to herself, her brush breathing life into a massive, blooming sunflower. Alexander had stopped dead in his tracks, his clipboard dropping to his side. In a hospital filled with sickness and sterile white walls, she was a sudden, blinding explosion of color and warmth. When she finally noticed him staring, she hadn't looked intimidated by his white coat or his intense, brooding glare. Instead, she offered him a smile so devastatingly pure and genuine that it felt as if she had reached into his chest and physically rewired his heart. "You look like you need to sit in a garden," she had told him, her hazel eyes dancing with amusement, "or at least sleep for a week." He had fallen for her with a rapid, terrifying velocity. She became his sanctuary. He remembered their first apartment together in a dilapidated brownstone in Brooklyn. The heating barely worked. The plumbing was a disaster, and their furniture consisted of a mattress on the floor and milk crates for bedside tables. But Alexander had never felt wealthier. He remembered a specific night in that freezing apartment. They were huddled together under 3 cheap, scratchy blankets eating lukewarm Chinese takeout straight from the cartons. He had been exhausted, vibrating with the stress of a grueling rotation. But as Clara rested her head against his chest, tracing absent-minded patterns on his tattered undershirt, the anxiety had melted away. "I'm going to give you the world, Clara," he had whispered fiercely into the darkness, his jaw set with unwavering determination. "I'm going to build an empire. I'm going to make sure you never have to worry about a leaking roof or a broken heater ever again. You'll have gardens, greenhouses, everything." Clara had tilted her head up, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to his jawline. "I don't need an empire, Alex," she had murmured, her voice laced with a gentle, grounding truth. "I just need you. As long as I have you, I have everything." Standing in his luxurious, silent office 10 years later, the echo of her voice was a cruel, mocking torment. Alexander clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. He had kept his promise. He had built the empire. He had conquered the medical world and amassed a fortune so vast it was almost incomprehensible. He could buy her 1,000 greenhouses tomorrow. But the devastating, suffocating truth was that in his relentless pursuit to give her the world, he had slowly, methodically starved the one thing she actually wanted: his presence. The ambition that had once been a shared engine for their future had mutated into a parasite, consuming his time, his empathy, and eventually his marriage. The transition hadn't been an explosive fight. It had been a million tiny, silent abandonments. A missed anniversary dinner, a cancelled weekend trip, a phone call sent to voicemail, until one day she was sitting across from him at a glass table signing her name on a divorce decree and walking out of his life without asking for a single dime of the empire he had built for her. Alexander violently slammed the sketchbook shut, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous office. He shoved it back into the bottom drawer and locked it with trembling hands. He couldn't afford to drown in this nostalgia. It was useless. It was inefficient. He downed the rest of his bourbon, the alcohol burning a fiery path down his throat, and forced the iron mask of the ruthless CEO back onto his face. He turned back to the window, watching the blizzard rage on, entirely oblivious to the fact that while he was trying to bury the past, Clara was currently lying on a cold wooden floor hundreds of miles away, her own time rapidly, mercilessly running out. The piercing chill of mid-December had settled over Manhattan, encasing the city in a biting, unforgiving frost. Alexander Sterling stepped out of a grueling 3-hour luncheon with the hospital's board of directors, the crisp collar of his charcoal cashmere overcoat turned up against the wind. He dismissed his driver with a curt wave, opting instead to walk the 4 blocks back to the Sterling Medical Tower. He needed the freezing air to clear his head. The merger was generating billions, yet a persistent low-grade agitation had taken root in his chest, a restless energy he couldn't quite diagnose. Seeking a temporary reprieve from the biting cold, he pushed through the heavy glass doors of an upscale, dimly lit espresso bar. The rich aroma of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries washed over him. He was halfway to the counter when he froze. Sitting in a secluded corner booth, clutching a paper cup with white-knuckled intensity, was Rachel. Rachel had been Clara's fiercely loyal best friend since their days at art school. She was usually a vibrant, outspoken woman, but the figure huddled in the booth looked entirely different. She appeared haggard, her shoulders slumped under the weight of an invisible burden, dark circles bruised beneath her eyes. She stared blankly out the frosted window, completely detached from the bustling energy of the cafe. Against his better judgment, Alexander changed his trajectory. He told himself it was simple courtesy, a perfunctory check-in, but the truth was he possessed a desperate, starving need for any information about Clara. "Rachel," he said, his deep voice cutting through the ambient noise of the cafe. Rachel jumped her head, snapping toward him. For a split second, her eyes registered pure shock. Then, as she took in his impeccably tailored suit, his perfectly styled hair, and the arrogant aura of absolute control, he naturally exuded the shock rapidly hardened into a fierce, incandescent rage. She didn't offer a polite greeting. She didn't even stand up. "What do you want, Alexander?" Her voice was a low, venomous hiss, dripping with a contempt so profound it made him physically recoil. Alexander maintained his composed, stoic facade, though a fracture of unease began to splinter in his mind. "I was just getting coffee. I didn't expect to see you. How is she doing?" "Rachel is Clara." "Well." Rachel let out a harsh, broken laugh that contained absolutely no humor. It was a terrifying, hollow sound. She stood up, slamming her coffee cup onto the table so hard the dark liquid sloshed over the plastic lid. "How dare you?" she breathed, stepping into his personal space, completely uncowed by the billionaire surgeon. "How dare you stand there in your custom suit, counting your billions, and casually ask me how she is doing like you're inquiring about the weather?" "Rachel, I simply asked a question. The divorce was mutual. We agreed to a clean break." "A clean break!" Rachel interrupted, her voice trembling with barely suppressed hysteria. Tears, hot and furious, suddenly welled in her eyes. "You think that's what that was? You think she walked away from the only man she has ever loved because she wanted a fresh start? God, you are supposed to be the most brilliant diagnostician in this city, but you are the blindest man I have ever met." Alexander's clinical instincts, honed by years of life-or-death emergencies, suddenly flared to life. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The anger in Rachel's voice wasn't just protective bitterness regarding the divorce. It was fueled by a deep, frantic grief. "Chu, what are you talking about?" Alexander demanded, his authoritative CEO persona instantly vanishing, replaced by a sharp, demanding urgency. "Explain yourself. Where is Clara?" "She wouldn't want me to tell you," Rachel choked out, wiping a furious tear from her cheek. "She made me swear not to tell you. She wanted to protect your precious empire, Alex. She knew that if you knew the truth, your suffocating ego would force you to try and fix it. But you can't fix this. Not with your money and not with your scalpels." The bustling cafe seemed to completely mute around him. A cold, heavy dread, thick as wet concrete, settled in the pit of Alexander's stomach. He stepped closer, grabbing Rachel's arm, his grip desperate and unyielding. "Rachel, look at me. What is wrong with my wife?" "She isn't your wife anymore," Rachel spat out violently, yanking her arm out of his grasp. She grabbed her purse, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and profound sorrow. "You signed those papers. You washed your hands of her so you could play God in your hospital. Enjoy your empire, Alexander. I hope it keeps you warm at night, because it cost Clara her entire life." Rachel shoved past him, rushing out the glass doors into the swirling snow. Alexander stood paralyzed in the center of the cafe. The words echoed in his skull, deafening and catastrophic. Asterisk. It cost Clara her entire life. The subtle signs he had completely ignored suddenly flashed before his eyes in a horrifying montage: the dramatic weight loss, the translucent pallor of her skin, the oversized sweaters she wore to hide her frail frame, the lingering exhaustion in her hazel eyes on the day they signed the divorce papers. A wave of nausea hit him so hard the room spun. He had thought she was grieving their marriage. He had thought she was simply broken-hearted. He lunged for the door, bursting out into the freezing street, but Rachel had already disappeared into the dense Manhattan crowd. Alexander yanked his phone from his coat pocket, his hands shaking violently. Hands that had flawlessly repaired thousands of beating hearts were now trembling uncontrollably. He bypassed his corporate contacts and directly dialed the private number of his head of security, a former intelligence officer who could track a ghost. "Marcus," Alexander barked the moment the line connected, his voice a ragged, breathless command that lacked all of its usual polish. "I need you to find Clara. Put every resource we have on it. Track her credit cards, her phone, her medical records. I don't care what it costs or what laws you have to bend."
"Sir, is she in danger?" Marcus asked, confused by the sheer panic in his boss's voice.
Alexander looked up at the towering glass monolith of his own hospital, the empire he had traded her for. A single tear, hot and desperate, escaped his eye, freezing instantly against his cheek. "I think," Alexander whispered, his voice breaking, "I think she's dying." 3 days. 72 agonizing hours had evaporated since Alexander's catastrophic encounter with Rachel, and the brilliant, omnipotent CEO of Sterling Medical was slowly losing his mind. His elite security team, led by Marcus, had turned the city and the surrounding states upside down, but Clara had orchestrated her disappearance with a devastating, airtight precision. She had paid for everything in cash, abandoned her credit cards, and left her phone in a rusted dumpster in Brooklyn. She had vanished like a ghost into the biting winter air. Alexander paced the length of his penthouse, a half-empty glass of scotch abandoned on the kitchen marble island. The empire he had sacrificed her for now felt like a suffocating prison. He had not slept, his mind perpetually replaying Rachel's venomous words. It cost Clara her entire life. The sheer terror of being too late gnawed at his sanity. He was a man who could command armies of doctors, yet he was utterly powerless to find the one woman he needed to save. By Friday night, a brutal nor'easter had descended upon New York, grounding commercial flights and turning the streets into slick, hazardous rivers of ice. Inside the Sterling Medical Trauma Center, the atmosphere was a controlled, frantic chaos. The emergency room was a war zone of sirens shouting medics and the relentless metallic screech of ambulance stretchers. High above the city, fighting through the blinding snow and violent crosswinds, a medevac helicopter miraculously touched down on the hospital's reinforced roof. The pilot had risked his own life to make the flight, driven by the desperate pleading of a rural Maine doctor who knew the local clinic completely lacked the resources to save her. The flight medics rushed a gurney through the freezing wind and into the elevator. The patient was a young woman who had collapsed in a local pharmacy, her frail body finally surrendering to the devastating war raging inside her blood. In the chaotic, panicked transfer, her purse and identification had been left behind on the icy floor of the store. She arrived at Sterling Medical as a Jane Doe, a critical, failing body with no name and no history, fighting a losing battle against profound systemic collapse. 50 floors below the helipad in his soundproof executive office, Alexander was staring blindly at a digital map of New England, his eyes burning with exhaustion. The sudden, shrill ringing of the red emergency phone on his desk shattered the silence. He snatched the receiver. "Sterling." "Alex, it's Evans," the chief of trauma's voice barked through the line, tight with extreme stress over the background din of screaming medical monitors. "I know you're not on the rotation tonight, but I need your hands in Trauma Bay 1, now." Alexander pinched the bridge of his nose, his clinical persona immediately fighting through his personal despair. "I'm a CEO, Mark, not an ER resident. Call the on-call cardiothoracic surgeon." "Huh. Dr. Hayes is scrubbed in on a massive multi-car pileup," Evans snapped back, desperation bleeding into his tone. "This is a Jane Doe medevac from Maine. Late-stage leukemia, acute respiratory distress, but she's developed a massive rapid pericardial effusion. The fluid is crushing her heart. Her platelets are practically non-existent. If anyone else tries to drain this, she bleeds out on the table. You are the only one with the precision to do this blind and fast. She has maybe 10 minutes before she codes." The mention of leukemia sent a violent, icy shiver down Alexander's spine, a phantom echo of Rachel's horrifying warning. He aggressively pushed the thought away. He couldn't afford to be compromised by his own paranoia. A patient was dying in his hospital. "Prep a pericardial window tray," Alexander commanded, his voice turning into cold hard steel. "I'm on my way down." He dropped the phone, stripping off his custom suit jacket and throwing it over the leather chair. He tore off his silk tie, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt as he sprinted toward the private executive elevator. He swiped his badge, the doors closing to shut out the quiet of the executive wing. As the elevator plummeted toward the ground floor, Alexander closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to slow, locking his personal agony into a compartmentalized box. He mentally visualized the anatomy of the heart, the exact angle of insertion needed to bypass the lungs and pierce the sac without nicking the myocardium. He was no longer a terrified, regretful husband. He was Dr. Alexander Sterling. He was the machine. The doors slid open to the overwhelming cacophony of the emergency department. Alexander moved through the crowded corridors with terrifying predatory speed nurses and orderlies instinctively flattening themselves against the walls to let the billionaire surgeon pass. He grabbed a pair of sterile gloves from a dispenser, snapping them onto his hands as he approached the heavy swinging doors of Trauma Bay 1. The room was a frantic blur of motion. A dozen blue-scrubbed medical professionals swarmed around the central gurney, shouting vitals and drawing syringes. The heart monitor was shrieking a rapid, erratic rhythm, ventricular tachycardia, the terrifying prelude to a complete cardiac arrest. "Heart rate is 180, and climbing pressure is bottoming out 50 over palp," a nurse screamed over the din. "Get out of my way," Alexander roared, his voice cutting through the panic like a physical blade. The crowd of doctors and nurses instantly parted, creating a path to the operating table. Alexander stepped up to the gurney, his eyes focused entirely on the patient's chest, raising his gloved hands to receive the scalpel from the scrub nurse.
Give me the blade and prep the ultrasound," he ordered, not yet looking at the woman's face. "Let's decompress this heart."
He looked down, his gaze traveling from the sterile drape over the patient's chest up to the plastic oxygen mask covering her face. The scalpel slipped from Alexander's fingers, clattering loudly onto the metal tray. The sharp, metallic clatter of the scalpel hitting the stainless steel tray echoed through Trauma Bay 1 like a gunshot. For a fraction of a second, the frenetic energy of the emergency room ground to an unnatural, suspended halt. Dr. Evans, the chief of trauma, looked up in utter bewilderment. Alexander Sterling, a surgeon renowned for his absolute machine-like composure, had never dropped an instrument in his entire illustrious career. But Alexander was no longer a surgeon. He was a man standing at the epicenter of a catastrophic earthquake, watching his entire universe shatter into jagged, irreparable pieces. Under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the surgical lights, the Jane Doe's face was fully illuminated. The translucent, bruised skin, the hollowed cheekbones, and the thinning, matted auburn hair could not hide the fundamental architecture of the woman he had pledged his life to. He recognized the delicate curve of her jaw, the small pale freckle resting just beneath her left collarbone, a constellation he had kissed 1,000 times in the dark. It was Clara, his quiet, beautiful Clara. "Alex," Dr. Evans asked, his voice tight with rising panic. "What is wrong with you? We need to decompress now." Alexander couldn't breathe. The oxygen had been violently sucked from the room, replaced by a suffocating, leaden dread. His mind fractured violently, colliding with Rachel's warning from 3 days ago. Asterisk. It cost Clara her entire life. He had been searching the entire eastern seaboard with his elite security team, yet here she was dying on a metal table in the basement of his own billion-dollar empire. She looked so agonizingly frail, completely stripped of the vibrant, glowing light that used to define her. "Clara," Alexander whispered. The name was ripped from the deepest, most ragged depths of his soul, a sound so utterly broken that it made the scrub nurses freeze. Suddenly, the relentless, rapid beeping of the heart monitor shifted. It deteriorated into a chaotic, terrifying screech. The erratic peaks and valleys on the screen flattened into a chaotic, shallow scribble. Ventricular fibrillation. Her heart was quivering, no longer pumping blood. She's coding VFib," a nurse screamed. "Starting compressions." The nurse lunged forward, locking her hands over Clara's sternum. "Don't touch her!" Alexander roared. The sound was a primal, thunderous explosion of pure protective terror. He shoved the nurse back with such force she stumbled into a crash cart. Her platelet count is 0. If you do chest compressions, you will shatter her ribs and she will bleed out internally in seconds. Back away from her. Alex, she is dying, Evans yelled, moving to grab the defibrillator paddles. Do! Give me another scalpel, Alexander barked at the scrub nurse, his eyes wide and entirely bloodshot. Now! The terrified nurse slapped a fresh blade into his palm. Alexander looked down at his right hand, the hand that had perfectly executed thousands of microscopic vascular repairs, the hand that had ruthlessly signed a multi-billion-dollar merger. It was shaking, violently. A wave of paralyzing fear crashed over him. If his hand slipped by a millimeter, he would slice into the myocardium. He would be the one to kill her. But if he did nothing, she would be gone in less than a minute. He squeezed his eyes shut for 1 microscopic second, inhaling a sharp, ragged breath. He thought of her laugh. He thought of her painting in the greenhouse. He banished the terrified husband and summoned the ruthless, brilliant surgeon she desperately needed him to be. He opened his eyes. The tremor in his hand vanished, replaced by an unnatural, desperate stillness. Alexander moved with terrifying, blinding speed. He made the incision just beneath her sternum, dissecting through the subcutaneous tissue and muscle without hesitation. He didn't wait for the ultrasound guidance. Operating entirely on muscle memory genius and pure adrenaline, he navigated blindly toward the pericardial sac. He felt the tense, swollen tissue beneath his fingertips. With a precise, agonizingly careful flick of his wrist, he pierced the sac. Immediately, dark pressurized fluid rushed out, draining into the sterile basin. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the mechanical hum of the ventilators. Every pair of eyes was glued to the monitor above the bed. 10 seconds passed, an eternity. Then the chaotic scribble on the screen violently jerked. It spiked into a sharp, clear peak, then another, and another. The screeching alarm silenced, replaced by the steady, rhythmic asterisk beep, beep, beep asterisk of a normal sinus rhythm. Her heart, freed from the crushing pressure, was beating on its own again. A collective, massive gasp of relief filled the trauma bay. Dr. Evans let out a shaky breath, stepping back. Pressure is stabilizing. Good God, Alex. That was... I've never seen anything like that. Alexander didn't hear him. The scalpel slipped from his fingers again, splashing quietly into the basin. The iron wall of his professional composure, the invincible armor of the billionaire CEO, completely and utterly disintegrated. He leaned heavily against the operating table, his broad shoulders shaking violently. He ripped off his surgical mask and sterile gloves, letting them drop to the floor. Ignoring the blood on his cuffs, he reached out with trembling bare hands and gently, reverently cupped Clara's pale, icy face. "I'm here, Clara. I'm right here," he choked out, his voice cracking. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, spilled from his piercing blue eyes, dropping onto the sterile blue drapes covering her chest. He pressed his forehead against hers, sobbing openly, a shattered king weeping over his dying queen. "Please, God, don't leave me. I am so sorry. I am so damn sorry." The trauma staff watched in stunned, uncomfortable silence. The most ruthless, feared man in New York City was completely unraveled, kneeling at the altar of a Jane Doe. Alexander finally lifted his head, his eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying possessiveness as he looked at Evans. "Prep the VIP intensive care suite on the top floor. Lock down the entire wing. No one goes in or out without my explicit authorization." Alex, standard protocol for unassigned patients. "She is not an unassigned patient," Alexander snarled, his voice vibrating with a lethal protective fury that left absolutely no room for debate. He looked down at the woman who had sacrificed everything for his empire. "She is my wife." The VIP intensive care suite on the 50th floor of Sterling Medical was a fortress of reinforced glass-brushed steel and suffocating silence. Designed for visiting dignitaries and billionaires, it was an impenetrable sanctuary that overlooked the glittering icy grid of Manhattan. But tonight, All the wealth and privilege in the world felt utterly useless. Clara lay in the center of the cavernous room, her frail form swallowed by the crisp white linens tethered to the earth only by the sleek state-of-the-art machinery humming softly around her. The rhythmic mechanical hiss of the ventilator was the only sound in the room, a brutal artificial substitute for the breath Alexander had once listened to as he fell asleep beside her. Alexander stood near the foot of her bed, refusing to sit, refusing to blink. He had stripped off his ruined dress shirt, now wearing a dark blue surgical scrub top that felt like a familiar armor. But there was no armor thick enough to protect him from the crushing weight of reality. The heavy door to the suite clicked open softly. Marcus Alexander's head of security stepped into the dimly lit room. In his large hands he held a battered, water-stained leather tote bag, the same bag Alexander had bought for Clara in Paris, the one she had carried out of the lawyer's office on the day of their divorce. "The medevac crew recovered this from the floor of the rural pharmacy where she collapsed, sir," Marcus said, his voice unusually subdued. He pulled a thick manila envelope from the tote. "Her medical records from the local clinic in Maine were inside. I thought you would want them immediately." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Thank you, Marcus. Leave it on the desk and wait outside. No one enters."
Marcus nodded respectfully, placing the heavy envelope on the mahogany desk in the suite's adjoining private office before stepping out.
Alexander stared at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. He slowly walked into the adjacent room, leaving the door cracked so he could still see Clara's monitor. He sat heavily in the leather chair, reaching for the file. His hands, which had been steady enough to pierce a swollen pericardial sac just hours ago, were trembling violently again. He pulled the thick stack of papers out and spread them across the desk under the harsh glare of the reading lamp. As the brilliant analytical CEO, Alexander was accustomed to reading medical charts with cold clinical detachment. But as he looked at the name Clara Sterling printed at the top of the page, the letters blurred. He flipped to the first chronological entry. It was an initial blood work panel from a prestigious oncology center in Manhattan. He looked at the date in the upper right corner. March 14th. Alexander's breath hitched in his throat. March 14th was 8 months ago. They had still been married. They had still been living in the same penthouse. He turned the page. April 2nd. A bone marrow biopsy report. The diagnosis was printed in stark, unforgiving black ink. Acute myeloid leukemia. Highly aggressive variant. Stage I4. A sickening wave of vertigo washed over him. Alexander desperately searched his photographic memory, matching the dates on the fatal medical file with the timeline of his corporate conquests. On April 2nd, he had been in Chicago aggressively negotiating the supply chain logistics for the Vanguard merger. He remembered sitting in a luxury steakhouse, ignoring a phone call from Clara because he was too busy charming a board member. While he had been drinking vintage wine and securing his empire, his wife had been sitting alone in a sterile white room, listening to a doctor hand her a death sentence. His hands shook harder as he flipped through the subsequent pages, each one a chronological map of his colossal failures as a husband. There were consultation notes, declining blood counts, and lists of harrowing symptoms. She had endured the bone-deep aches, the crushing fatigue, and the terrifying realization of her own mortality entirely in the dark. She had laid beside him in their massive bed, carrying the weight of a terminal illness, and he had been too consumed by his spreadsheets and surgical schedules to notice she was fading away. Then he found a final consultation note dated August 10th, the exact day they had sat across from each other in the downtown law firm and signed the divorce decree. Alexander's eyes scanned the oncologist's frantic handwritten notes. Patient firmly refuses all aggressive chemotherapy and bone marrow transplant protocols. Prognosis without intervention is less than 6 months. Patient states she is finalizing personal affairs and relocating to a rural palliative setting. When urged to inform her husband, a prominent surgeon patient adamantly refused. Quote, "He is building his dream. I will not let my death be the anchor that stops him." The paper slipped from Alexander's fingers, fluttering silently to the floor. The air vanished from the room. The truth hit him with the catastrophic force of a collapsing building, crushing his ribs, shattering his ego, and obliterating every lie he had told himself for the past year. She hadn't stopped loving him. She hadn't wanted a fresh start. She had known she was dying, and she had looked at his relentless, suffocating ambition and made a choice. She had signed those divorce papers to set him free. She had walked out into the freezing city, carrying a terminal diagnosis in her designer bag, choosing to die in agonizing, isolated obscurity, just so Alexander Sterling could have his precious empire. "Oh God!" Alexander gasped, a ragged, ugly sound tearing from his chest. He slid off the leather chair, his knees hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The invincible billionaire, the ruthless titan of New York healthcare, collapsed completely. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders heaving as he surrendered to a wave of grief and self-loathing so immense it felt lethal. He had convinced himself he was giving her a clean break, but he had actually sent her away to die alone. He had traded the only pure, beautiful thing in his life for a hollow crown of glass and steel. Alexander wept on the floor of his own hospital, the agonizing, tearing sobs of a man who had finally realized he was the villain of his own story. The empire he had built meant absolutely nothing. He would burn it all to the ground, trade every billion, every hospital, and every accolade just to go back to that freezing Brooklyn apartment and hold her one more time. Dawn crept over the jagged skyline of Manhattan, casting a pale, fragile golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the VIP intensive care suite. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving the city buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of white snow. Inside the room, time had effectively stopped. Alexander had not moved from the hard plastic chair beside her bed for 10 hours. His customized suit was gone, replaced by blood-stained surgical scrubs. His hair was disheveled, and the sharp, aristocratic face of the feared CEO was heavily lined with a terrifying, raw exhaustion. He held Clara's cold, fragile hand tightly in both of his, resting his forehead against her knuckles as if she were his only tether to the earth. Slowly, the steady, rhythmic hiss of the ventilator shifted as Clara's own breathing began to fight against the machine. Her eyelids, bruised and translucent, fluttered open. At first, the world was a blurred, confusing haze of white ceilings and flashing digital monitors. She expected to see the rotting wooden beams of her main cottage, to feel the bitter draft of the ocean wind. Instead, the air was warm, sterile, and smelled faintly of expensive cedar and antiseptic. She turned her head weakly against the pillow, the movement sending a dull ache through her chest, and her gaze locked onto the man sitting beside her. Alexander's head snapped up at the slight movement of her hand. His piercing blue eyes, usually so hard and calculating, were completely bloodshot and brimming with a desperate, wild hope. "Clara!" He breathed, the sound tearing from his throat like a prayer. "You're awake. Don't try to speak, sweetheart. You're intubated. Just look at me." Panic flared instantly in Clara's hazel eyes. Her mind, foggy with sedatives, scrambled to understand how she had ended up back in his world, back in his hospital. She weakly tried to pull her hand from his grasp, a defensive instinct to protect him from the ugly reality of her dying body. But Alexander refused to let go. He held on with a gentle, agonizing desperation, pressing her palm against his unshaven cheek. A nurse quickly entered, checking the monitors and gently removing the breathing tube, replacing it with a soft oxygen mask. "Her vitals are stabilizing, Dr. Sterling," the nurse whispered before quietly retreating, giving the billionaire privacy. Clara swallowed hard, her throat raw and burning. "Alex," she rasped, her voice barely a phantom whisper. You shouldn't be here. You need to go back to work. The merger..." The mention of his empire, the very thing that had destroyed them, broke the final crumbling dam inside Alexander's soul. He slipped out of the chair, his tall, imposing frame collapsing entirely. The most powerful man in New York healthcare dropped heavily to his knees on the cold tile floor, burying his face into the edge of her mattress. "I know." Alexander sobbed, the sound so violently broken and ugly that it made Clara's heart shatter. He wept with the absolute unrestrained agony of a man who was watching his entire universe burn to ash. "I know everything, Clara. Marcus brought your bag from Maine. I read the file. I read the dates." Clara closed her eyes, a single hot tear tracking down her pale cheek. Her greatest secret, the sacrifice she had endured, agonizing isolation to protect, was out. "I didn't want you to know," she whispered, her fingers weakly stroking his messy hair. "I didn't want to be the anchor pulling you down. You worked so hard for your dream, Alex. I just wanted you to be free." Alexander jerked his head up, his face slick with tears, his eyes blazing with a fierce, self-loathing fury. "Free!" he choked out, his voice vibrating with raw anguish. "Do you think I have been free for a single second since you walked out of that law firm? I have been living in a graveyard, Clara. I built a billion-dollar empire, and I would burn every single brick of it to the ground right now, just to have one more day in that freezing Brooklyn apartment with you." He reached up frantically, cupping her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "I was so blind. I was so arrogant. I thought I was giving you the world, and I didn't even realize I was starving you to death. You were sitting in oncology wards alone, and I was drinking champagne in boardrooms. I am so sorry. God, I am so completely, entirely sorry." Clara looked at the powerful, ruthless CEO, reduced to a weeping, shattered man on his knees. There was no anger in her heart, only a profound, tragic relief. She didn't have to be strong anymore. She didn't have to die alone in the dark. "Alex, it's okay," she murmured, a weak, forgiving smile touching her pale lips. "My body is just tired. You have to let me go now." "No," Alexander growled, the word erupting from him with sudden, lethal intensity. The tears remained, but the terrifying, brilliant surgeon was suddenly resurrecting behind his eyes. He stood up, leaning over her, his presence dominating the entire room. He kissed her forehead with a fierce, territorial reverence. "I am never letting you go again. Do you hear me? You signed those papers, but you are still my wife. You are my soul, and I am not going to let a disease take what is mine." He grabbed her hand, pressing it over his own racing heart. "You sacrificed yourself for my empire, Clara. Now I am going to use every single resource, every $1 billion, and every drop of my own blood to save yours. You are not fighting this alone anymore. I am going to fix this." Over the next 48 hours, Alexander Sterling did not just utilize his billion-dollar empire, he weaponized it. The ruthless, calculating CEO who had spent the last 3 years obsessing over profit margins and corporate acquisitions vanished, replaced entirely by a desperate, fiercely protective husband who viewed the medical world as a battlefield and his wife's illness as the only enemy that mattered. He immediately delegated all day-to-day operations of Sterling Medical to his chief operating officer, indefinitely postponing his involvement in the Vanguard merger. Wall Street buzzed with frantic speculation, but Alexander couldn't have cared less if his stock plummeted to zero. He transformed the penthouse VIP suite into a global command center. Within days, he had flown in the most brilliant oncologists and hematologists from Switzerland, Tokyo, and Johns Hopkins, assembling a medical strike team with a singular unified objective: saving Clara's life. They formulated an aggressive, groundbreaking treatment plan involving an experimental, targeted chemotherapy regimen, followed by a bone marrow transplant. However, there was a catastrophic hurdle. The trauma from the pericardial effusion had severely compromised her mitral valve. Her heart was too weak to survive the brutal toxicity of the chemotherapy. She needed a complex valve repair before the cancer treatment could even begin. The hospital's ethics committee strongly advised against Alexander performing the surgery, citing severe emotional compromise. Alexander had stood before the board, his piercing blue eyes as hard as diamonds, and calmly informed them that if anyone tried to stop him from operating on his wife, he would personally dismantle their careers and buy the board out. There was no debate. On the morning of the surgery, Alexander stood in the scrub room, the rhythmic rush of water echoing against the sterile tiles. He looked at his hands. They were steady. The paralyzing terror that had gripped him in the emergency room was gone, replaced by a profound, razor-sharp clarity. He walked into the operating theater not with the cold detachment of a machine, but with the warm, fierce dedication of a man fighting for his soul. The surgery lasted 6 grueling hours. Every incision, every microscopic suture was a silent apology, a physical manifestation of his desperate love. When he finally successfully repaired the valve and watched the monitor display a strong, perfect rhythm, the heavy, suffocating weight he had carried for months finally lifted. He had stabilized the foundation. Now she could fight. And fight she did. The ensuing 6 months were a brutal, harrowing journey through the darkest valleys of medicine. Clara endured the bone marrow transplant, her body ravaged by the aggressive treatments. But this time, she was not alone. Alexander never left the VIP suite. He slept on a small cot beside her bed. When she was too weak to eat, he patiently fed her ice chips. When the pain made her cry out in the dead of night, he climbed into the narrow hospital bed, wrapping his large protective frame around her frail body, whispering stories of the gardens they would plant when she was healed. He learned the quiet, profound patience he had never possessed. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her breathing, anticipating her needs before she even voiced them. He became the man he had promised to be in that freezing Brooklyn apartment 10 years ago. By the time spring arrived, painting New York City in soft, hopeful hues of green and gold, the impossible had been achieved. Clara was in full remission. On a bright Tuesday morning in May, the financial world was rocked by a brief, definitive press release. Dr. Alexander Sterling was officially stepping down as CEO of Sterling Medical Innovations. He retained his seat on the board and announced a return to a highly limited, specialized surgical practice, but the crown of the empire had been willingly surrendered. Far away from the flashing cameras and the ringing phones of Wall Street, Alexander stood on the sprawling wooden porch of an estate in upstate New York. It was a rustic, beautiful property surrounded by acres of wild blooming meadows and old-growth oak trees. He held 2 mugs of hot chamomile tea, walking down the steps toward the massive glass-enclosed greenhouse he had built specifically for her. He pushed the door open, the warm, earthy scent of damp soil and blooming orchids washing over him. Clara was standing by her easel wearing a paint-splattered pair of overalls. Her auburn hair had grown back into a soft, beautiful halo of curls, and the radiant, sun-kissed warmth had finally returned to her skin. She was humming softly, her brush flying across the canvas. Alexander set the mugs down and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the sweet scent of lavender that he had missed for so long. "You're going to miss it," Clara whispered playfully, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "The boardrooms, the power, the empire." Alexander turned her around, his hands coming up to cup her face. He looked into her bright hazel eyes, tracing his thumb over the faint fading scar on her chest, a permanent reminder of the day they had almost lost everything. "I already have the world, Clara," he murmured, his voice thick with a profound, unshakable peace. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, deep kiss that held the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. "I'm looking right at my empire.